The store had long since emptied, the lights dimmed to their evening glow, and the quiet hum of refrigeration units was the only sound echoing off the freshly mopped floors. Brandon Walker, founder and CEO of one of the most successful retail chains in the country, leaned over a mop bucket like any ordinary janitor, the name Mike stitched on the front of his navy blue uniform. Most would have walked past him without a second glance, and that's exactly what he wanted. For weeks he had buried his title, his designer suits, and his polished reputation to live a different reality, that of an invisible worker. The decision wasn't made out of boredom or vanity. Brandon had received unsettling reports, anonymous complaints about toxic culture, unmotivated staff, and declining morale. Instead of launching a corporate review or sending in HR, he decided to step inside the world he'd built, undetected, and see for himself. It didn't take long for one particular employee to stand out. Her name was Emma Johnson. Young, soft-spoken, and always working. Always. She was the type of person who didn't need to be reminded to double-check the front displays or clean up spills. Emma often stayed later than scheduled, folding uniforms, restocking shelves, and tidying corners no one else bothered with. What struck Brandon most was not just her diligence, but her complete detachment from her co-workers. She turned down after-shift dinner invites with a polite shake of her head and never touched the snacks management left in the break room. While others laughed and lingered, Emma worked in silence, her smile tired but genuine, her movements brisk and purposeful. She was the type of employee most owners dream of, yet something didn't sit right. The curiosity crept in. Slowly at first. Was she just incredibly disciplined? Did she simply prefer solitude? Or was there something else? Something harder to explain, hiding behind her ever-present poise. Brandon found himself watching more closely. Not in a patronizing way, but with genuine concern. He noticed the worn soles of her shoes, the way she often rubbed her wrists when she thought no one was looking, and how she always packed her belongings with urgency, eyes darting toward the clock like each second counted. She never waited for a ride, never stopped for food. She simply disappeared into the night. And for the first time in his undercover stint, Brandon couldn't stop thinking about someone after his shift ended. That night, as the final employee exited with a laugh and a wave, Brandon remained in the shadows, mop abandoned. He watched Emma fold her apron neatly and slip it into her faded canvas bag. She wore the same jacket she always did, thin and fraying at the cuffs, and pulled it tight around her as if bracing for more than just cold. As she stepped through the sliding doors and onto the dark sidewalk, Brandon hesitated. Then, without quite knowing why, he followed. He didn't have a plan, didn't know what he expected to find. Maybe it was guilt, knowing he was the man who owned the building she worked herself into exhaustion inside. Maybe it was instinct, the same one that had helped him build an empire. Or maybe, just maybe, it was the recognition of something deeply human in her silence. Someone trying desperately to hold it together without asking for help. Brandon kept his distance, careful not to alarm her. Emma walked quickly, head down, clutching her bag like it held her whole world. Her pace didn't slow as she passed closed storefronts and dimly lit corners. This wasn't the kind of neighborhood where people took leisurely strolls at night. As the city thinned out and graffiti-covered walls replaced boutique windows, Brandon felt the shift in his chest, the gnawing sense that he was about to see something he wasn't prepared for. He didn't think he'd gone far when Emma finally stopped in front of a crumbling brick building with a faded sign that read, "Haven Shelter." She didn't hesitate. She didn't look around. She just walked in as if she'd done it 100 times before. Brandon stood frozen beneath a flickering street lamp, the pieces falling into place. Emma wasn't just quiet. She wasn't just hard-working. She was homeless. A knot formed in his stomach, tightening with every second he stood there. All this time, he'd been sweeping floors alongside someone who had no place to go after her shift ended. A person who gave more to his business than some full-time managers, yet didn't even have a bed to return to. He could have turned back, could have gone home to his penthouse and filed this discovery under "good to know." But instead, Brandon pushed open the shelter's door and stepped inside. completely unaware that this choice would change both of their lives forever. The moment Brandon stepped into the shelter, the air changed. Gone were the sterile white tiles and bright fluorescence of his store. Here the lighting was softer, though dim, the scent a mixture of disinfectant and warm soup. It was quieter than he expected, not chaotic or loud, but filled with an undertone of movement and fatigue. Thin mattresses lined the walls, and volunteers moved about quickly, handing out plastic cups of water and plates of food with practiced efficiency. For a second, Brandon felt out of place, not as a business owner, not even as a janitor, but simply as someone who had never truly understood what it meant to be without a place to call home. He hesitated in the doorway, unsure if he should even be there, when something across the room caught his eye. Emma. She wasn't sitting or resting. She wasn't waiting for food or a bed. She was working. Wearing a volunteer apron over her worn sweater, Emma moved gracefully between the rows of people, placing blankets into their hands and kneeling to speak with them softly. She comforted an elderly man as she helped him with his coat, then gently guided a mother and her toddler to a spot near a heating vent. Her hands moved fast, her face calm, and even though Brandon could tell she was exhausted, there was no sign of complaint, only quiet dedication. He stared, stunned, as realization bloomed inside him. Emma wasn't just surviving here, she was giving. Giving her time, her energy, whatever was left after a full shift on her feet. A voice beside him pulled him from his thoughts. New here? Brandon turned to see an older man with silver hair and kind eyes, his name tag reading George. Brandon nodded slowly, still processing what he was seeing. Yeah, just trying to help out. George followed his gaze and chuckled. That's Emma. Been coming here for months. Hard not to notice her. Brandon swallowed hard. She volunteers here every week, George confirmed. After she finishes at that grocery store down the block. Sometimes even on her days off. Brandon's heart twisted. She works all day and then comes here to do this. George nodded like it was the most normal thing in the world. Says it keeps her grounded. Says it's not about what you have, it's about what you give. Brandon's eyes lingered on her again. Emma had just helped an older man sit down and was now wiping off a small table for the next group of guests. He noticed the slight limp in her walk, the subtle wince as she stretched too far, but still, she didn't slow down. Does she stay here? Brandon asked quietly. George glanced at him thoughtfully. Sometimes. We've offered her a bed plenty of nights, but she usually sleeps in the common area or storage. Says there are other people who need the beds more. Brandon felt a lump form in his throat. She gives up her own bed? George nodded, his voice low. Every chance she gets. The words echoed in Brandon's mind. A woman with no permanent home giving away what little comfort she might claim, donating part of her paycheck, volunteering her already worn-out body. Emma wasn't just an exceptional employee. She was someone who lived by principles most people only talked about. And Brandon, with all his influence, resources, and wealth, had walked past her every day without truly seeing her. He felt a wave of shame ripple through him. How many others like her had he failed to notice? How had his systems missed this? More importantly, how could a woman with so little give so much without anyone truly noticing? For the next hour, Brandon stayed near the back, quietly observing. He watched as Emma swept the floor after dinner service, gathered trash bags without being asked, and patiently helped fold linens. Even after the other volunteers left, she remained, tidying up the last few corners of the room like it was her responsibility alone. There was no pride in what she did, only quiet intent. When she finally grabbed her bag and headed toward the exit, Brandon followed her again, this time not out of curiosity, but out of a growing sense of responsibility. He had come undercover to fix low morale. Instead, he'd uncovered a truth that would haunt him. Emma wasn't just someone falling through the cracks. She was the kind of person who held up the people in those cracks, and Brandon knew without a shadow of doubt he couldn't walk away from this unchanged. Back in the store the next evening, Brandon couldn't concentrate on anything else. The polished floors and neatly stacked shelves now felt superficial, a performance masking the reality that someone like Emma, someone who gave everything day after day, had nowhere to sleep that night. The image of her working in the shelter, serving soup with that tired but compassionate smile, haunted him. She didn't just give effort, she gave heart. And Brandon couldn't shake the guilt of knowing that he, the man with the power to make real change, had gone so long without noticing. But he also knew Emma. Not well yet, but enough to understand one thing. If he approached her the wrong way, if he made it seem like charity, she'd pull away. This couldn't be about rescue. It had to be about respect. So Brandon started small. He paid closer attention, really paid attention. Emma's uniform, always clean, had faded seams and loose threads. Her shoes, once just scuffed, now showed signs of real wear, the soles nearly separating at the heel. When she reached for items on the top shelf, her sleeve slid back, revealing small cracks along her knuckles, the kind caused by cold weather and too much scrubbing. Her eyes, always bright with politeness, now showed a flicker of something deeper, exhaustion that ran all the way down. Still, she never complained, never slowed down. She moved through her shift with a quiet intensity, as though she had something to prove, not just to others, but to herself. Brandon began trying to talk to her more. Not prying, just asking the kinds of questions co-workers might ask. "Long night, huh?" Or, "Don't you ever take a break?" But Emma always responded with a smile that shut the door gently. "They're all long," she would say, or "Can't afford to." Her words were never bitter, only honest. One night, Brandon asked if she'd ever thought about applying for a different position, maybe something easier or more stable. Emma's smile faded for a moment. "A lot of people don't have that choice," she replied, her voice soft but steady. Then she walked away, leaving Brandon standing there, struck not just by her situation, but by how deeply rooted her strength was. Frustrated by how little she revealed, Brandon returned to the shelter on his own. He walked in just after the dinner rush and spotted George near the back, stacking chairs with a slow, practiced rhythm. "You again?" George asked, grinning. "Didn't think you'd be back so soon." Brandon offered a sheepish smile. "Thought I could help out a little more?" George didn't question it. He just handed him an apron. As they wiped down tables together, Brandon glanced across the room at Emma, who was crouched down helping a woman calm her crying child. "Has she always been like this?" he asked quietly. George nodded. "Biggest heart I've seen. Been volunteering here since her mum passed." That detail caught Brandon off guard. "Her mum?" George nodded again, more slowly this time. "Breast cancer. Emma tried everything. Treatments, extra jobs, even sold her apartment to pay the bills. After her mum passed, she couldn't keep up. She had nowhere left to go." Brandon said nothing for a long time. He watched Emma as she helped fold blankets and restocked the paper towels in the bathroom. Even here, where she had every right to just rest, she was moving, giving, showing up for people who needed something to hold on to. In that moment, something shifted for Brandon. He no longer saw her as just an employee. She was a symbol of everything right in a world that often rewarded the wrong things. But she was also fragile, barely keeping her life stitched together, and no one, least of all her, seemed willing to admit how close she was to falling apart. Brandon wanted to help, desperately, but he couldn't just throw money at the problem. That wasn't what Emma needed. What she needed was someone to believe in her, to invest in her without taking away her dignity. And Brandon knew the only way forward was with quiet, consistent effort. Meeting her where she was, not where he wanted her to be. Over the next few days, he began laying the groundwork. Nothing dramatic. An extra sandwich left in the break room, an offer to help unload a late delivery, a comment on how reliable she was, how the store ran smoother when she was around. Emma accepted the sandwich without a word, nodded at the compliment, and slowly, very slowly, began responding in kind. She even laughed at one of his jokes once, a small, surprised sound that lingered in Brandon's ears for the rest of the night. It wasn't progress he could chart on a spreadsheet, but it was real, and it was the beginning of something neither of them could yet name. Brandon returned to the shelter the following evening, apron already in hand, blending once more into the quiet rhythm of after-dinner cleanup. He didn't go there to observe Emma, at least not entirely. By now it had become something more. The shelter, once just a place where he uncovered a heartbreaking truth, had started to feel like a different kind of boardroom, one where character mattered more than profit, and compassion was the real currency. George, as usual, was wiping down a long plastic table when Brandon approached, nodding in greeting. "You're a glutton for cold soup and hard chairs," the older man joked. Brandon smiled faintly. Something like that. But his tone was different tonight. Thoughtful, heavy with the weight of things he still didn't understand. "George," he began carefully, "can I ask you something about Emma?" George leaned back, crossing his arms as if bracing for something personal. "You can," he said slowly, "but whether I answer depends on why you're asking." Brandon hesitated only a moment. "Because I want to help her, but I don't want to disrespect her. I need to understand who she is, not just what I see on the surface." George studied him for a moment before sighing. "Well then, you'd better understand the heart she's carrying." He glanced toward the far end of the room, where Emma was crouched beside a stack of donated blankets, folding each one with meticulous care. "Her mom," George began, "was her whole world. They lived in a small apartment across town. Emma was in school part-time, working 2 jobs. Everything they had went toward keeping her mum comfortable." Brandon listened in silence as George's voice softened. "It was breast cancer. Aggressive. Emma tried everything. Every treatment, every medication, even alternative therapies. She drained her savings, maxed out credit cards, sold furniture. Eventually, she even gave up the apartment just to keep up with the bills. She thought if she could just hold on a little longer, something would work. But it didn't." Brandon swallowed hard, a lump forming in his throat. "After her mum passed," George continued, "Emma had nothing left, no money, no home, no support, but the thing is, she never once stopped showing up. Not here, not at work. She just kept going." Brandon's eyes drifted back to Emma, who was now gently tucking a blanket into the arms of an older woman who had dozed off in a chair. "She could have broken," he whispered. "Easily," George nodded, "but instead, she came here. Started volunteering the same week she moved in. Said it helped her stay grounded. And she never asks for anything. Won't take a special spot in line, refuses handouts. Even when we've tried to help her with housing or job connections, she says the same thing every time. If I didn't earn it, I don't want it." That kind of pride might seem stubborn to some, but to Brandon it made sense. He had built his own empire from scratch, after all. He knew what it meant to want to succeed on your own terms, to refuse shortcuts, even when they were handed to you on a silver platter. But Emma wasn't chasing wealth or status. She was chasing dignity. That was what struck him most. She didn't see herself as a victim of bad luck or unfair systems. She saw herself as someone temporarily knocked down, fighting to stand again, one step at a time. For the next hour, Brandon worked quietly, all the while watching Emma through a different lens. Everything she did, from serving water to folding sheets, had purpose behind it. She wasn't just helping out. She was honoring her mother, carrying forward a legacy of care in the only way she knew how. And while the world might have written her off as someone without means, Brandon now saw her as one of the wealthiest people he'd ever met. In character, in strength, in grace, she had every reason to crumble, yet she remained unshakable. As the night wore on, Brandon made a quiet vow to himself. If Emma insisted on earning everything, then he'd make sure she had a real opportunity to do just that. Not a handout, not a rescue, but a path. A doorway to something bigger, built on the foundation she'd already poured with her own hands. And maybe, just maybe, he'd walk through that doorway beside her, not as her boss, not even as her savior, but as someone who finally saw her for who she really was. Brandon knew better than to rush things. After learning about Emma's past, the crushing medical bills, the loss of her mother, the shelter, and her refusal to accept anything she hadn't earned, he understood that trust wouldn't come quickly. So he started with small gestures. He left extra food in the break room fridge without saying a word. Nothing fancy, just things like sandwiches, fruit, or bottled water. He never pointed them out, and Emma never acknowledged them aloud, but he noticed she always took the items last. Never greedily, just as if she'd quietly accepted the offering without letting her pride be bruised. He also began showing up to help stock shelves at the end of each shift. When shipments arrived late, Brandon would roll up his sleeves and move crates side by side with Emma, pretending it was just part of being a helpful co-worker. He'd ask questions about how she organized inventory or how she handled difficult customers, not to test her, but to listen. As days turned into weeks, something began to shift. Emma started speaking more during their tasks, even laughing occasionally when Brandon made a dry joke or a clumsy mistake while stacking cans. It wasn't warmth exactly, not yet, but it was an opening, and Brandon could feel it. She was letting her guard down, if only by inches. One night, while the two of them were sweeping the aisles, Brandon casually brought up something that had been on his mind for days. "Management's been talking about creating a new training role," he said, not looking directly at her. "Someone to help new hires get up to speed, sort of like a junior supervisor." Emma glanced over, pausing with her broom mid-sweep. "Yeah?" she said cautiously. "Yeah," Brandon nodded. "I think you'd be perfect for it." The silence that followed was sharp. Emma stared at the floor for a second, then shook her head. "I'm not supervisor material," she said softly. Brandon frowned, surprised. "Why not?" She forced a half smile. "Because people like me don't get those jobs. I don't have a degree. I barely get enough sleep, let alone time to learn something new. And what if I fail?" Her voice cracked slightly on the last word, and she quickly turned away. Brandon wanted to say 100 things, but he didn't. He backed off gently, sensing that if he pushed further now, he might lose the fragile trust she'd started to place in him. "Okay," he said quietly, "but just so you know, I see what you do around here, and it matters." Later that week, Brandon decided to swing by the shelter again after his shift. He wasn't sure what he was looking for, maybe just reassurance that Emma was doing okay. As he approached the block, he saw her stepping out of the shelter's side entrance, clutching her bag tightly, her jacket pulled close. She looked tense, her body stiff as she tried to walk quickly down the sidewalk. Brandon slowed when he noticed a figure stepping out from behind a parked car. A man, younger than Brandon, but rough around the edges, wearing a hoodie and a smirk that immediately set off every alarm in Brandon's chest. The man said something to Emma. Brandon couldn't hear it, but the tone was sharp. Emma tried to step around him, but he moved in front of her again, blocking her path. The moment froze. Brandon could see Emma's entire body lock up, her shoulders hunched, her hands clenched around her bag. Then the man reached out and grabbed her arm. Brandon stepped forward instinctively, but Emma suddenly yanked her arm away, spun around and ran back toward the shelter doors. The man didn't follow. He just stood there, watching her disappear inside, then slowly walked away in the opposite direction, as if nothing had happened. Brandon's fists were clenched so tight his nails bit into his palms. His pulse pounded in his ears. He didn't chase the guy. Not yet. He didn't even call out. Instead, he stayed in the shadows, breathing hard, watching the entrance to the shelter until he was sure Emma was safe inside. That night, Brandon barely slept. He stared at the ceiling of his penthouse apartment, the lights from the city casting fractured shadows on the walls. He kept seeing the look on Emma's face, that brief moment of panic, of fear, so raw it stripped away all the strength she usually carried like armor. It wasn't just homelessness or pride that Emma was fighting. It was something darker, something that had followed her from the past and still had its claws in her. And suddenly, Brandon understood the weight she carried, why she flinched when people got too close, why she avoided anything that might make her vulnerable. This wasn't just a woman trying to survive. This was someone surviving in spite of constant danger. And he knew, without question, he had to do more than just watch from the sidelines. He had to stand beside her, even if she never asked him to. It was a cold Wednesday night when everything came to a head. Brandon had stayed later than usual at the store, pretending to mop the back room just to be around when Emma's shift ended. He had a gut feeling, one he couldn't shake since the last time he saw her being harassed by that man outside the shelter. Something about the way she moved lately, more cautious and withdrawn, told him she wasn't sleeping well, that she was still looking over her shoulder. So when she quietly clocked out, waved goodnight to the front counter, and slipped into the night alone, Brandon followed, staying just far enough behind to keep her in view without startling her. They had barely made it 2 blocks when Kyle appeared from behind a vending machine at the edge of the alley beside the shelter. He stepped out quickly, almost as if he'd been waiting. Emma flinched so violently that Brandon immediately broke into a faster stride. Kyle reached for her arm, voice raised, though Brandon couldn't make out the words yet. Emma tried to step back, but Kyle yanked her wrist hard, pulling her toward him. That's when Brandon sprinted. "Let her go!" he shouted as he closed the distance. Kyle turned sharply, his expression shifting from smug to defensive in an instant. "Who the hell are you?" he spat. Brandon didn't answer. He stepped between them, placing himself squarely in front of Emma. "I said let go!" Kyle scoffed. "This doesn't concern you." Brandon didn't flinch. "It does now." Emma's eyes were wide, trembling. Her wrist was red from where Kyle had grabbed her. "It's fine," she said quickly, her voice cracking. "He's just leaving." But Kyle didn't move. "We've got history," he said with a twisted grin. "She's got things she owes me." Brandon felt the last thread of patience snap. "She doesn't owe you anything," he said, his voice cold and quiet. "And if you touch her again, I promise you'll regret it." Kyle finally backed off, his smirk fading under the weight of Brandon's words. He turned and walked away, muttering something under his breath. Brandon waited until he was out of sight before turning to Emma. "Are you okay?" She didn't answer. She looked down at her feet, shoulders slumped, the mask she wore every day completely gone. "I didn't want you to see that," she whispered. "Emma, who is he?" Brandon asked gently. "I need to know." She hesitated, then let out a long, shaky breath. "His name is Kyle. We used to live together after my mum died. I thought he was helping me, but he wasn't. He controlled everything, my money, my job, where I went. He said he'd take care of me, but really, he just broke me down, little by little." Her voice wavered, but she didn't stop. "When I finally left, I had nothing. No apartment, no savings. He drained everything. That's how I ended up at the shelter." She paused and looked up at Brandon with tear-filled eyes. "And now he won't stop. He just keeps showing up." Brandon felt something heavy settle in his chest, part sorrow, part fury. "You should have told someone," he said softly. "You shouldn't have had to go through all of that alone." Emma looked away. "I didn't think anyone would care or believe me." Brandon shook his head slowly. "Well, I do, and I believe you." He took out his phone, already dialing as he spoke. "We're going to fix this. I'm getting you legal protection, a restraining order, and I'm hiring someone to find out everything we need to know about him. He won't touch you again. Not now. Not ever." Emma didn't respond right away. She just stood there, eyes wet, lips trembling, before finally whispering, "Why are you doing this?" Brandon met her gaze. "Because you matter, and because no one who works as hard or gives as much as you do should ever have to live in fear." That night, he didn't leave her side. He waited while she checked into the shelter, made sure the staff knew what had happened, and stayed until she was safely inside. Then he sat in his car across the street and called his lawyer. The words were clear and calm, but behind them was a storm. A man like Kyle thought no one would protect someone like Emma, but Kyle was about to learn something new. The woman he tried to break had more strength than he'd ever imagined. And now she had someone standing beside her who wouldn't let her fall. Brandon had spent years learning how to read a room, how to feel when the timing was right. In business meetings, it was second nature. But this wasn't a boardroom, and Emma wasn't an investor. She was something else entirely. Resilient, guarded, and deserving of more than life had handed her. That morning, as the store lights blinked to life and the first delivery truck pulled into the back lot, Brandon made up his mind it was time to take a risk. Not just for the store's sake, or even hers, but for both of them. If he truly wanted to help Emma build a better future, it couldn't just be about protection. It had to be about belief and trust. When she arrived for her shift, the circles under her eyes were a little lighter, the tension in her shoulders a little looser. She greeted him with a small but real smile, the kind she rarely gave. After a few hours of restocking and helping customers, Brandon waited until they were alone in the break room. He handed her a clipboard, feigning casualness. "I wanted to show you this," he said. Emma raised an eyebrow and took it. Her eyes scanned the top line. Assistant manager, application packet. Her head snapped up. "What is this?" Brandon met her gaze evenly. "It's a real offer, not pity, not charity, just an opportunity you've already earned." Emma blinked, clearly stunned. "You think I can actually do this?" He smiled gently. "Emma, you're already doing half this job without the title. You train new employees, you organize shifts when managers call in sick, you solve customer problems without being asked. You lead, whether you realize it or not." Emma looked down, her fingers tightening around the paper. "But what if I mess it up? What if it's too much?" Brandon leaned forward. "Then you ask for help, and we figure it out together. That's what leaders do." For a long moment, she said nothing. Then she nodded. Just once. "Okay," she whispered. "I'll try." Later that same afternoon, Brandon was reviewing inventory when he heard a commotion near the entrance. A voice, low, angry, familiar, cut through the chatter like a blade. He stepped out from the stockroom and froze. Kyle, standing just inside the front doors, pacing, demanding to speak to Emma. A few customers had already backed away nervously. Emma, behind the customer service counter, had gone pale. Her hands were shaking, clutching the edge of the register like a lifeline. Brandon moved fast. He signaled security with a sharp nod. Two guards approached Kyle, who immediately began shouting, "You can't make me leave! She owes me!" Brandon stepped forward, his voice like ice. "She owes you nothing. And if you don't leave now, the police will take it from here." Kyle turned to face him, eyes blazing. "Who do you think you are?" Brandon didn't blink. "Someone who protects what matters." The guards flanked Kyle, and after a few more protests, they escorted him out the door. Brandon waited until the lobby was quiet again before turning to Emma, who stood frozen behind the counter. "He's gone," he said gently. "You're safe." But the words felt hollow to him, because the truth was, he wasn't just protecting her from Kyle. He'd also been hiding something important. And now, more than ever, he knew he couldn't keep pretending. That night, as they closed the store together, Brandon walked beside Emma in silence. The air was crisp, the streetlights casting soft glows on the sidewalk. She didn't ask questions about what had happened, but he could see the unease still lingering in her eyes. That's when he knew. Tomorrow he'd tell her the truth. No more pretending to be Mike, the janitor. No more half-truths or delayed confessions. She deserved honesty, real honesty, even if it risked everything he'd been trying to build. Back in his apartment, Brandon sat at his desk staring at the employee's schedule. Emma's name was now listed under assistant manager, training phase, a title she had earned on her own without knowing who he truly was. He thought about her reaction when she'd accepted the position, how the light in her eyes had flickered just slightly with pride, and he realized that lying to her wasn't protecting her, it was keeping her from the full truth. And if they were ever going to move forward, whatever forward even meant, it had to start with him stepping out from behind the curtain and showing her the real Brandon Walker. Tomorrow, he'd do it. Not as her boss, not as a man trying to save her, but as someone who saw her strength, respected her resilience, and finally trusted her enough to tell her everything. It was just after closing, and the soft hum of the store's fluorescent lights seemed louder in the stillness. Brandon stood in the break room, alone, the weight of what he was about to do pressing heavily on his shoulders. He had rehearsed the conversation a dozen different ways in his head. Still, he wasn't sure how Emma would take it. She had every reason to feel betrayed, because in a way, he had betrayed her trust, not by being cruel or dishonest in intent, but by hiding the truth of who he was and letting her believe he was just Mike, the quiet janitor with a kind heart and a mop. Now, that illusion had to end. She deserved the truth, even if it cost him everything he had built with her so far. Emma walked in 5 minutes later, hair tied back, sleeves rolled up, clipboard in hand. She looked tired but focused, ready to tackle the next task on her list, as always. She barely noticed Brandon sitting there until she glanced up. "You still here?" she asked, her voice light. "Thought you clocked out already." Brandon stood slowly. "Emma," he said gently, "can we talk for a second? There's something I need to tell you." She paused, immediately sensing the shift in tone. She put the clipboard down. "Okay," she said cautiously. "What's going on?" He took a breath. "My name's not Mike. It's Brandon Walker." She blinked, the name not registering right away. "Walker, like," he nodded, "like the owner of this entire chain." The silence that followed was thick and electric. Emma's mouth parted slightly, as if to speak, but no sound came. Then she stepped back, crossing her arms tightly. "You've got to be kidding me." "I'm not," Brandon said quietly. "I've been undercover for the past few months, visiting locations, trying to understand what's really happening on the ground. I didn't come here looking for you or trying to play some game. I just—" "So what was I?" she interrupted, her voice rising. "An experiment? A case study? You watched me struggle, followed me, learned everything about my life and never said a word?" Brandon swallowed hard. "No, Emma, it wasn't like that. At first, I didn't know anything. I just saw someone who worked harder than anyone else, who never asked for anything but gave everything. And then I started caring." Emma's eyes flashed. "And still, you lied." "I didn't lie," he said. "I just didn't tell you, because I didn't want you to feel like I was handing you something out of pity. You earned that promotion, every late night, every customer you helped, every shift you stayed to clean. You deserved more, and you proved it, without knowing who I was." She looked away, her face a mask of conflicted emotion. "You don't get it," she said after a long pause. "I've spent years fighting for every scrap of respect, every ounce of progress. And now, all of this job, this opportunity, it feels like it's built on a lie." Brandon stepped closer, but not too close. "Then let me be clear," he said firmly. "You got this job on your own. I didn't pull any strings. I didn't ask anyone to treat you differently. You led the way." "I just recognized it." Emma turned back to him, her voice quieter now. "Why didn't you tell me earlier?" He hesitated, then answered honestly. "Because I was afraid. Afraid you'd see me as just another guy in a suit trying to rescue someone who didn't ask for help. And you're not that person. You're not a victim, Emma. You're a leader, and I didn't want my name to take that away from you." The room fell silent again, but this time the air between them wasn't so sharp. Emma looked at him for a long moment, searching his face for anything false. When she spoke, her voice had softened, but it was still laced with hurt. "I don't know what to think," she whispered. "That's okay," Brandon replied. "Take your time. I just needed you to know the truth, and I needed you to know this. None of what I've offered comes from guilt or obligation. It comes from respect, from knowing you're exactly the kind of person this company should be built around." Emma didn't answer. She simply nodded, picked up her clipboard, and walked out of the room. Brandon didn't follow. He stayed behind, watching the door close slowly, unsure of whether he had just lost the most important connection he'd made in years or taken the first real step towards something honest and new. Emma didn't return to the store the next morning or the day after, and for Brandon, those 2 days felt like weeks. He tried not to worry, tried to give her the space she needed to process the truth he had finally revealed, but the silence gnawed at him. Every time the front door opened, he looked up, hoping it might be her. It never was. Still, he refused to call or send a message. He knew better. Emma was the kind of woman who needed to make her decisions on her own terms. After everything she had endured. Kyle, the shelter, the weight of living in survival mode for so long. Trust was something earned, not expected. On the third day, just as Brandon was preparing to leave for a late afternoon meeting, she walked in, quiet, composed, and with a steady determination in her eyes. Brandon stood from behind the front counter, heart pounding. "Emma," he said, his voice careful. She didn't smile, but there was no anger in her face, just resolve. "I've been thinking," she said, walking toward him, "and I've decided. I want to take the assistant manager job." Relief surged through him, though he kept his expression calm. "You sure?" he asked. Emma nodded. "I'm tired of being afraid of the next step. I know it's not going to be easy, but I want to try. Not because you offered it, but because I'm ready." The following week, Emma began her training. Brandon watched quietly from the background as she navigated her new role, reading schedules, managing staff questions, learning how to handle inventory reports and customer escalations. The first few days were rough. She second-guessed herself, apologized more than necessary, and hesitated before making decisions. But she never quit, and each day she grew a little more confident. Staff who used to just walk past her began asking her for help. Customers remembered her name. Even the most seasoned team members started to defer to her, recognizing her quiet authority. It was during one of their afternoon check-ins in the break room, surrounded by paperwork and coffee cups, that Emma surprised Brandon with a proposal. She cleared her throat, visibly nervous but firm. "I've been thinking about the shelter," she said. "There are so many people there who want to work but just need a chance. What if we created a partnership? Maybe start with part-time roles or job training programs, something to help them get back on their feet." Brandon stared at her for a beat, not because he was unsure, but because he was overwhelmed by how naturally she had stepped into leadership, not just as a manager, but as someone who saw beyond profit margins and schedules, someone who remembered where she came from and who still reached back to lift others up. "That's brilliant," he said, the corners of his mouth lifting into a genuine smile. "Write it up. I'll approve whatever you need." Emma blinked. "Seriously?" "Seriously," Brandon nodded. "You're not just helping this store, Emma. You're helping people like you used to be, people who are too often overlooked. That's exactly the kind of leadership we need." She exhaled, smiling just a little. "Okay then. I'll put together a proposal. Take your time," Brandon added. "But just know, whatever it looks like, I'm in." That night, after the store closed, Emma stayed late, typing out her first draft in the office. Something she never imagined herself doing even a few weeks ago. The girl who once folded her apron in the dark, afraid of being seen, was now designing a pathway for others to be seen, to be hired, to be valued. Brandon passed by the window once and paused. She hadn't noticed him. She was focused, calm, glowing with a new sense of purpose. And in that moment, he realized this wasn't just about giving her a job. This was about watching someone rise, on her own terms, and knowing he had helped clear the way, not with a handout, but with a hand held open in respect. Emma Johnson, assistant manager, was no longer someone surviving in the shadows. She was stepping fully into the light, and bringing others with her. The air outside the shelter felt different this time, lighter somehow, like it carried less weight on Emma's shoulders. She paused at the front steps, staring at the familiar door, but today she wasn't hesitating out of fear or shame. This time, she wasn't here to sleep in the corner of a shared room or to volunteer with empty pockets. She was here with something to give. Something lasting. Dressed in her store's assistant manager uniform, a clean clipboard in hand, Emma pushed open the door with the calm, confident grace of someone who had fought for every inch of her self-worth and finally claimed it. Inside, the shelter buzzed with its usual late-afternoon rhythm. Volunteers sorted supplies, a few women chatted quietly over paper cups of coffee, and children played near the bulletin board tacked with flyers. Howard, the longtime volunteer who had once offered her warm meals and kind words when she had nowhere else to go, looked up from a table and smiled when he saw her. "Emma Johnson," he said, rising. "I knew we'd see you again, but I didn't expect you like this." She grinned as she walked toward him. "Things change." Then she held up the clipboard. "I wanted to talk to you about a new opportunity." Over the next hour, Emma outlined her proposal with clarity and passion. She shared how her store, under Brandon's full support, was creating a hiring program specifically for those transitioning out of hardship. Part-time roles, resume training, mentorship. Not as charity, but as a bridge. "People just need a door to open," she said. "Not all the way, just enough for them to step through it themselves." Howard listened, nodding with growing pride. "You're not just making changes," he said. "You've become the change." When she stepped out of the shelter afterward, the sun had begun to dip below the buildings, casting the street in a golden haze. Brandon was waiting at the corner, leaning casually against a lamppost with his hands in his jacket pockets. He didn't say anything as she walked toward him. He just smiled in that quiet, steady way that reminded her he wasn't going anywhere. And for once, she didn't feel the need to explain herself, to shrink, or to hold her breath. She simply walked beside him, shoulder to shoulder, without apology or fear. They strolled together down the sidewalk, passing the storefronts that had once felt so distant from her world. Now they felt like a part of her journey. A grocery store that once paid her minimum wage now carried her vision. A shelter that once held her secrets now echoed with her leadership. Emma had stepped out of survival and into something far more powerful: purpose. At one point, Brandon glanced over at her and said, "You know, when I first met you, I thought I was here to fix things." Emma smirked, her eyes forward. "Turns out, I just needed a place to build from." He nodded slowly. "You built it well, and you didn't take shortcuts." She glanced at him then, her expression softer. "Neither did you." They walked on in silence, the rhythm of their steps in sync. Emma no longer felt like someone running from her past. She felt like someone creating a future. And this future wasn't built on secrets, fear, or pity. It was built on trust. Trust in herself. Trust in the people who had stood by her. And trust in the path that lay ahead. Forged not by luck or rescue, but by resilience, honesty, and the quiet bravery of showing up every single day, ready to lead. If this story moved you, inspired you, or made you reflect on the quiet battles people face every day, we invite you to become part of our journey. At Deep Inside HQ, we uncover powerful stories that shine a light on resilience, justice, and humanity. Every like, comment, and share helps amplify voices that deserve to be heard. So don't forget to subscribe, turn on notifications, and join a community that believes in truth, compassion, and change from the inside out.